Have you ever been on a development team where documentation is like a bad word? You know, the kind of place where the code is great, but the documentation is non-existent? Well, today we're going to change that. If you've ever struggled looking through code, wondering what it does, how it may interact with a database, or you find a dire message in there like, do not touch this code, then this video is for you. Welcome to Flight School, where we show you practical ways to use codename Goose. Goose is an open source AI agent from Block that runs on your local machine, uses the Model Context Protocol to interact with extensions for apps you already use, and connects to a large language model of your choice. Flight School is here to help teach you how to automate tasks and make your life easier as a developer. Today, I'm going to show you how to use Goose to generate documentation and explanations for code that's already written and some prompt engineering along the way. Now, you might be the one who wrote the code, and now you're wondering why you did something a particular way. Or you're new on a team and you find some code that doesn't have comments in it, and you're not sure exactly what the code does. We're going to have Goose analyze some code and write us some explanations and some great documentation to get up and running quickly. Now, I have a sample project here that I'm going to use as an example. Don't worry, this isn't code that we use at Block. This is just a sample app that I'm building as a home project. It's a data access layer API written in Python that provides a RESTful interface to a relational database. I have other apps that are going to interact with this database, but I don't want to implement and maintain database code in each one. I wanted to build an API instead. At a really high level, this database is tracking information about subscribers who are reading newsletter content. So our challenge, well, the code works great, but there's no documentation. I've taken out pretty much all comments, anything that might describe what every endpoint is doing. There's very little descriptive stuff in here at all. So here are our end goals. We want other developers to quickly understand the endpoints that we've made so far. We want teams to know how to use each API route correctly. We want to make sure everyone understands the data models and relationships, and we want new team members to get up to speed quickly. So let's see how Goose can help us write clear, comprehensive documentation for this app. So here's what we're working with. I've got my code pulled up in VS Code, and this is a fast API service written in Python. Now, if you've used fast API before, you might have a file like main.py or app.py to get you started. Looks like we also have a Docker file here that we could probably use to document later on. Now, as a side note, fast API will generate some documentation and API reference pages for us, as well as interact with the API when that app is running. It's kind of baked into fast API, but let's pretend that we don't know how to use that yet. We want to create our own documentation here. So to get us started, we have a few tables for the information that we're briefly going to go through and talk about the endpoints that we have so far. It looks like we have a folder for our models, and this is where we're describing the tables and the fields that we have access to in our database. We can see that we've got some newsletter content, we've got some metadata about the newsletters themselves, we have our users for things like their email address and some login details, and then we have a model for the subscription that tells us who is subscribed to which newsletter and where they are in the progress of receiving the newsletter content. Next, we see a folder called routers, and this is where we've built our API endpoints for accessing user data. Let's have a look through that. So we've got a lot of code in here. Looks like maybe we've got something in here that creates a new user. We've got something in here to log in and maybe get an access token. We've got a delete function in here. Looks like we've got something with an admin flag in order to fetch all users. So there's quite a bit in here that we need to kind of figure out what all of this does. It looks like we also have a couple of other files out here like auth.py. This looks like where it's doing this wrapper function to determine whether a user is an admin. We've also got this utils.py down here, which looks like this is what's creating our access token. So it looks like we have some helper functions. So it looks like we've got little stray bits of code here and there that we're going to need to analyze as well. So zooming out for a moment, the project includes some fast API routes for our CRUD operations. We have some models representing our database schema. We have authentication and authorization middleware. Maybe we have some helper and utility functions for other common bits of functionality. And while the code is solid, there's no documentation. Comments are missing. We have no getting started information, no README file. And new team members are going to have to dig through the code to try to understand what every endpoint does and how to use it properly. So let's start by having Goose analyze our API code. Let's start with our first prompt. I'm going to say I have some code, and I'm going to give it the folder that this is in. It's relative to my home folder. And I'm going to tell it that it's written in Python. Analyze this code and learn the following things. So the first thing that we're going to ask it for is a summary of all endpoints and their purpose. The second thing we'll ask for is a summary of the data models and their relationships. Third, we'll ask about the authentication methods and authorization to use the API. Next, we'll have it look through any common code and helper methods. And then we'll have it look through some common patterns in the API design. And then we'll just wrap this up and say, I'll ask for other help later. For now, give me a summary of what you find. So Goose is going to start looking through the code and analyzing what it's finding. It immediately recognized main.py as our entry point. Looks like it also found our auth.py as well as the routers and the models. It's looking through each of the router files. It's looking at the authentication middleware. And now it's starting to go through more of those endpoints for our user. And then it's going through our models. And now it's going to build a summary of what it finds. Great, so here's our summary. API has 2 main routers. It's giving us some information about the users. It tells us that the newsletter router is defined, but it's empty. And sure enough, if we come over here, that file hasn't got any code in it yet. Next, it's going to look at the data models and the relationships between them. It's kind of breaking down our many-to-one, one-to-many, and so on. It's looking through our authentication. It sees that we're using JSON web tokens. And then it's summarizing the common code and the helper methods that it found, the API design patterns that I started using, and some notable features. It's also even giving us some hints here about some potential areas for development, like, hey, this router is empty, but we have model support for what might go in there. All right, perfect. So Goose mapped out all the code. So this gives us a great foundation to start building out our documentation. So let's dig a little bit deeper into some specifics, and here's how I would prompt for that. I'm going to say, for each API endpoint, do the following. We're going to start by describing the purpose and use cases. Next, we're going to ask it to document the request and response formats, and then we will list any required permissions, and then to explain any data transformations that might happen. And finally, we'll ask it to note any rate limiting or caching behavior. So this is going to go back through the code. It's going to look through some dependencies as well. It's found our configuration file. And it's going to go a layer deeper now to help us understand what these API endpoints are all about. Now, again, there's no commenting anywhere in here. So Goose is basically analyzing only the code that it found and the database models to try to provide things like what would the purpose of this endpoint be. Keep in mind, it has no context at all other than the code that it's seeing. So it's coming through here and says, hey, this post is actually registering new users in the system. It knew that this was a registration endpoint, not just something to add users to the system, but this could be used to actually register new users. It's giving us a breakdown of the request and the response formats. It's telling us a little bit about data transformation, if any rate limiting or caching, if it found any code in there about that. So it's giving us a pretty thorough analysis of that code. And then it's asking like, hey, do you want to dive deeper into any specific part of this, or do you want to look at something else? We're going to keep going on our documentation. It found data transformation logic. This is exactly the kind of detail that we need. So let's go through and let's tell it to analyze more about the database. So we'll say, analyze the database models and document the following. First thing that we're going to do is tell us the model's purpose and any relationships to other models. Next, we'll ask it about any field constraints and validations. Finally, we'll look for common query patterns. And finally, we'll look for any performance optimizations. Now, based on this prompt alone, Goose knows to go look at just the models in here, and it's going to go gather all of those in more detail, and again, try to glean what the purpose of these files are. All right, and it looks like it found what we wanted. It went through, looked through our user model, found relationships, found the purpose of core user management for newsletter authors and subscribers, found our query patterns, found some ideas about performance optimizations and so on, looked through the newsletter model, found the content version model that we hadn't even really found, the message model for the content itself, and our subscription model for how users were actually subscribed. It's also giving us some general observations here about the relationship designs, well-structured many-to-many relationships. It's got some performance things here about indexing, maybe efficient data types, nullable fields where it's appropriate, and the use of enums, and potential improvements. So it's also telling us like, hey, we should have created at and updated at timestamps for all of our models. We could have composite indexes for more of those common queries that we have. And we could also add some soft delete capability, which is actually a really good idea here. And we can see down here at the bottom, Goose is saying, hey, do you want me to go even deeper on any aspect of this, or talk about what those query optimizations might be, or do we want to do something else? I think at this point, we're ready to start making our documentation. So we're going to tell it to generate a comprehensive OpenAPI spec file called openapi.yaml in the root folder of our project and include the following details. So we're going to tell it that we want detailed endpoint descriptions as well as the purpose summaries. Next, we want it to document the request and response formats. Next, we'll have it document the authentication requirements for those endpoints. And finally, we'll have it look at error scenarios and handling. Now again, because we're using Fast API, there's actually built-in features that will go build this OpenAPI spec file, but I want to see if Goose can create this for us as well. All right, looks like it's finishing up. It says I'm going to create this spec file based on the analysis we did, generated in YAML format, and it's going to go ahead and start creating that file. We see it show up over here in VS Code, and we can start scrolling through it already. We see it's got quite a lot in here about the different kinds of properties and their data types. We can also see that it's building out references for us in proper OpenAPI spec format. So yeah, this is looking really great. Good job, Goose. So we see it's done quite a lot here. It's given us a full API description, server configs, contact info, versioning info. It's talking about our JSON web token, bearer token auth. It's giving us quite a nice summary here of what it built out. So next we're going to have it build our internal documentation. So we're going to say create internal dev docs that explain the following. The first thing is how to authenticate to the API as a user and as an admin. Second thing we want are best practices for things like bulk operations. Next, we probably want to have it look through and document about any rate limits and maybe throttling behavior. And then we'll also look at common error scenarios and solutions, as well as our data model relationships and any constraints there. And let's tell it to write this into API documentation.md in the root folder of the project. So Goose is going to go through, kind of reanalyze everything again, and it's going to go create this documentation for us. Okay, so it went through and started building out the internal documentation, built a section on authentication, bulk operations, rate limits and throttling, error handling, data models, exactly what we asked it for, as well as some testing recommendations and some security best practices, maybe some performance optimization tips. Let's go see what it wrote. So it generated Markdown, gave us a little table of contents up here at the top, which is great. It's got a whole section on our user authentication, how to use that bearer token. It gives us some warnings that that token might expire after 30 minutes, but that's configurable. It's talking about admin only endpoints so far, as well as some best practices. So it wrote hundreds of lines of documentation based on what it found. Down here at the bottom, it's even sharing some database constraints to keep in mind. It's even recommending some query optimizations by creating additional indexes in our database. This is fantastic. All right, well, the only thing that's left is to build a good README file for new people on our team. We want to make sure that anybody that joins this project has an understanding of how to get things set up, how to find this other documentation that we found, and maybe how to run the service locally, maybe launch that Docker container and so on. So let's have Goose do that for us as well. So here in our prompt, we're going to ask it to do one more thing. We're going to say, generate a README file in Markdown for new team members joining this project. Include the following. First, we want to know about the project overview and the purpose of the project. Secondly, we want to link to the other documentation you generated. Next, we want to set up our development environment. And then next, we want to know how to run the service locally and how to run the Docker container. Before we send this off, let's also add a little hint in here that says, I think I heard that Fast API has some built-in API documentation generation as well. How do I run that and access it? We should probably also find one more thing in here that tells us how do we add database changes with this Alembic tool and do migrations. All right, well, let's send this off and let's see what this generates for us. So it started by summarizing what we asked it to do, and now it's actually working on it. Looks like it created the file over here, and it's giving us a summary of everything that it finished. It gave us a project overview, link to that other documentation that it generated, as well as the interactive API documentation that Fast API does for Swagger, which is also OpenAPI, as well as Redoc. It's telling us about setting up our development environment, how to run the service locally, as well as environment variables that we might need, database migrations using Alembic, and other Fast API documentation access, and so on. It's also giving us things like a troubleshooting guide and contribution guidelines. This is all pretty fantastic. We didn't even ask Goose to do this for us. So let's go take a quick peek at that README file. And sure enough, it's giving us our tech stack in here, how to clone the repo, how to set up the virtual environment, how to get that running, how to install our dependencies. It's even giving us the instructions for Windows developers. It tells us how to keep everything safe by putting it in environment. It's telling us how to run our app locally. It tells us how to build our Docker container. This is fantastic. It's doing so much for us. And again, hundreds of lines of documentation with no context at all, other than just scanning through the code. So there you go. Look at the quality of what it made. We took our minimally documented API and turned it into a well-documented service that other teams can easily understand and use. This documentation is going to save time onboarding new team members and help other services integrate with our API really efficiently. So let us know if you found this helpful. Let us know what you're going to go build with Goose. Drop us a comment and let us know what you'd like to see. Thanks for watching.